Most of us have had a bad day at work at some point, and if you haven't, my God, are you lucky? The sort of day where everything just seems to go wrong and all you want to do is just have the day end. It's probably fair to say that not many of us will have had quite as bad a day as a certain janitor who worked at the BlackFriars pub in Boston, Massachusetts. When he opened up one morning in 1978, he was probably expecting all the usual sights, smells, and messes that one might encounter if your job is to clean up after a particularly boisterous night of any reputable drinking hole. Maybe even just a fraternity house. It smells like stale beer. Spilled beer everywhere, dropped cigarettes, the hazy smell of smoke that probably stained the walls and floorboards. All of these would probably be more than manageable for you, especially if you're the janitor. But then again, maybe occasionally you'll find fluids of unknown origin that are best to just kind of cover in sawdust and then sweep it up without really worrying about exactly what they were. Instead, he was met with a sight that would probably stay with him until the day he died. There was more carnage than usual, and this time in the form of 5 dead bodies riddled with bullet holes. He had become the unwitting first witness to a crime that would shock the local community, make headlines further afield, and confound and confuse investigators both at that time and in the many years that have passed since. A killing that remains officially unsolved and cold-blooded murder that even seemed to take the criminal underworld by surprise with its ruthlessness. Today, we are looking at what became known as the BlackFriars Massacre and trying to uncover the truth among all the other confusion, because that's what we do on this channel. So today we're headed over to Massachusetts. I know, you're totally crushed, and specifically into Boston. Could it get any worse? Famed for its historical connection with Ireland, and also they did something else concerning the US, something that actually many local residents still place a great emphasis on in the modern age. You may know it more for its famous marathon or any number of sports teams. The Boston so some people say Celtics, some people say Celtics. I'm pretty sure it's a Celtic. In the NBA, the Boston Bruins in the NHL, and the Red Sox on the baseball diamond. As of 2023, the population was calculated to be just over 650,000 residents. When it comes to history, most, including your boy, would be familiar with the Boston Tea Party that occurred on the 16th of December, 1773, which was a demonstration of the people's unhappiness at having to pay tax to the British government. I think it was at 1% back then. Now we pay somewhere like 23 to 40% taxes. Anyway, some of its famous residents in the past included the writer Edgar Allan Poe and Paul Revere, the man who was said to have ridden through the night to warn the approach of the British. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in Boston. In modern times, if you can believe it, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch call home, well, at least Marky does. Also, this is home to the music of Dropkick Murphys that have incorporated the strong Irish heritage in their music over their whole career. It also is a city that has more than its fair share of organized crime and produced some notorious figures over the years. Many would argue that the peak of the prominent criminal activity ran through the majority of the 20th century and in particular intensified when the Winter Hill Gang under the eventual leadership of James Whitey Bulger would come up against the Italian-American Patriarca crime family, and some of these names would later be cast up in the aftermath of what we are looking at today. Opened in 1971, the BlackFriars pub was located on Summer Street in Boston. It was an Irish-themed pub that also ran as a disco later in the evening. By 1978, it was owned by a man named Vincent Solmonti, who had connections with different factions in the Boston underworld. The pub's manager was called John Kelly, but often went by the name Jack. He had initially been a reporter in both radio and television, where he specialized in investigative journalism. This line of work had brought him multiple connections in the same sort of circles that Vincent Solmonti operated in, and he hadn't been afraid to use these connections to get a scoop on the breaking story or gain access to information in interviews that most journalists wouldn't have had access to. While he had taken the job managing the pub, it was known that he was close to giving it up, with a view to going back to reporting and investigating, because that was really the gig that he enjoyed. He had secured a new role with a news outlet, and he was set to return shortly. After 7 years of operation in 1978, the janitor by the name of Jerry Robinson would enter the pub as normal on the morning of the 28th of June and find himself in the midst of a gruesome scene. Inside the pub's basement, 5 men had been shot dead, with each of them suffering multiple gunshot wounds. One of them was the owner, Vincent Salmonte. John Jack Kelly was another victim, and he had suffered the same fate. The other 3 men were named Freddie Del Vega, Charles Magarian, and Peter Maroth. Freddie Del Vega had multiple previous convictions and was a known associate of the Winter Hill Gang, the criminal organization that was led by James. These convictions were for drug charges and extortion. Charles Margarian also had some prior brushes with the law, albeit at a much lower level. He had been charged for drug possession and low-level theft in the past, but was not considered a serious criminal by any that knew him. Peter Maroth was the 5th man who had no known serious criminal convictions and was the manager at another establishment, and was also owned, or at least that was also owned, by Vincent Salmonte, and he was a personal friend of Jack Kelly's. All 5 of the men were in their 30s, with ages ranging from 31 to 37, and each had been shot at least once in the head with either an automatic pistol or a 12-gauge shotgun. Don't know if you know anything about 12-gauge shotguns, but that doesn't leave a lot of head left. So some of them also have been shot with both. The shootings had been conducted at close range, execution style, and the police would later state that some of them had portions of their heads removed by the gun blast. The police were called to the scene, and even in a place as familiar with violence as Boston was, and still is, it was classified by all involved as one of the most gruesome scenes and shocking cases in recent memory. There was blood spatter on the walls and on the floor of the basement, and surprisingly enough, the safe was just sitting open with around $15,000 in cash out there, just completely untouched. When combined with the method of killing, which law enforcement described as professional, it seemed to rule out robbery as the only motive, or really a motive at all. So it left the door wide open for police and the public at large to try to figure out what could have caused such a gruesome murder. Investigators would establish that the 5 men had stayed behind in the bar after closing time in order to play cards together, and that they had been surprised by gunmen sometime around 2 in the morning, forcing them all down into the basement. This presumption that the assailants caught them off guard is based on the fact that a number of weapons belonging to the victims were found at the scene, but none of them had been able to pull them in self-defense. The theory that seemed to make the most amount of sense was that the whole thing was a hit on one or several of the men that night. The rest of them were just collateral damage in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that is why it's always important to know who you're hanging out with. You know, you could be best friends with somebody, but if they're doing stuff, you might get caught up too. Like, typically, let's say, like, I've had friends that I no longer talk to in the past who, you know, maybe doing things with somebody's wife, and it's like, yeah, man, good luck with that. I'm not gonna be around this, and I kind of cut ties. If somebody's doing something super sketch, it's like, I'm not gonna be hanging around you and then end up taking a bullet for it. I'm out, dude. So the easiest way to figure out what really went down is to look at each victim and decide how likely it is that anyone had enough on them to need them killed. So if we start with the least likely, then we would argue that Peter Maroth is the cleanest out of the 5. He was there only in his capacity as a friend to Kelly and the manager of another one of Salmonte's business. He had no major criminal convictions or connections. Almost certainly, he was not the target. Charles Margarian is probably the next in line, since he may have had previous involvement in the law, but in the grand scheme of things, it was a relatively low-level sort of issue that he had, and it was considered to be pedestrian. He was not known to have any deep ties to a serious organization, and no information came out at the time or since that would indicate that he was in any sort of trouble that would merit, you know, a murder. Your kneecaps might be broken, sure, but not a murder. The remaining 3 victims are the ones that the investigations and news stories focused in on that time. Each of them had at least something in their lives that could have potentially drawn enough heat to merit such an extreme response. Freddie Del Vega did have a more substantial rap sheet, but his close association with the Winter Hill Gang would seem to make him maybe a less likely target rather than more. This long-standing relationship with a serious outfit meant that, yes, certainly he could have been involved in more serious criminality and maybe have more opportunities than most to upset someone enough to have himself taken out, as well as others, but anyone with any sense would know that killing a man with those connections to a powerful gang would risk bringing a lot more heat on themselves than they would probably really want to, or may even seem sensible. This is presuming that the killers were not associated with the same outfit that he was affiliated with. And since some were considering the possibility that maybe the hit had been under the direction of, or even committed by, the Winter Hill Gang, would they really have taken the life of one of their own in such a dramatic and chaotic fashion, or allowed him to get caught up as collateral when they got whoever they were really after? It seems unlikely. What then of the other 2 men? John Jack Kelly may have been the manager of the bar at that time, but it was well known that he had accepted a new job and was moving back into the world of investigative journalism. The question has to be asked. Had he maybe ruffled a few too many feathers when he was involved in his line of work before, or was someone concerned about what he'd report on if he started again? It was considered a possibility even by those who were close to him. Most acknowledged that while he had an uncanny ability to integrate himself with people from both sides of the law to get the stories that others couldn't, there was no doubt that this got him involved with plenty of unsavory characters. And these sorts of relationships and interactions can quickly turn very sour very fast, doubly so if they feel aggrieved or betrayed by something published about them or affecting them that ends up making the headlines. Again, this was an angle that was considered by law enforcement, reporters, and others who were simply trying to make sense of this situation, but it didn't seem to hold too much water in the end. If Jack Kelly had burned any of his bridges in the criminal underworld to the extent that they felt that he needed to be taken out, no acknowledgement of this fact came out at that time or in any of the years that have passed since. And while it was true he was getting back into the world of investigative journalism, it doesn't seem likely that he would have just been sitting on any particularly salacious story that would have been so bad for any of his criminal associates that it would merit a cold-blooded murder such as this, especially with the collateral damage. Because you never know who you're taking out, so to speak. So when we add in the fact that he left behind 4 children and a widow, even by the standards of most criminal organizations, this sort of targeted killing with 4 others taken out just for being there feels a little beyond what would realistically be sanctioned by any reasonable group. Of course, you can always take into consideration they are criminals, but that leaves us with Vincent Salmonte, the owner of the pub, as the victim and potential main target. On balance, when we look into his life, his behavior and his many business transactions and associations, it's definitely kind of at this point where we could start to see the most possibility of something lurking that might have caused him to be marked for death. He owned a number of other establishments, including the one that Peter Maroth managed, and had other legitimate interests in various other businesses. At the same time, he had a long-standing connection and association with the criminal underworld and was said to have been involved in the cocaine trade, which that's not good. So not all of his money-making ventures were quite as legitimate as the pub. Later rumors would begin to spread that at the time of his death, he'd been heavily in debt with one criminal organization in the city. Well, the amount of money he was said to have owed would be worth taking his life, and those of 4 innocent men is really hard to say. And the money being left in the safe would also seem to indicate that if this was a motive for the Blackfriars Massacre, it was more about sending a message than really trying to get that money back. However, information gathered from informants after the fact indicated that there was a belief that Salmonte had a substantial amount of drugs inside of that safe that night. Some suggested as much as 3 pounds of the white horse, as they call it, with a street value of over $300,000. And that was back then. So, more now. So according to police reports, there was nothing like that in the safe when they searched the premises. This could lend some credence to the theory that this was retribution for drug debts, or maybe a deal had gone bad, and that Vincent Salmonte's dodgy dealings had finally caught up with him, sweeping up the 4 other men in its wake. If the assailants had gone in to take his life and steal the drugs, then leaving the money would make it look like it really wasn't a robbery at all. After all, $15,000 in cash only seems like a lot when there isn't $300,000 worth of drugs sitting right next to it. So the question then becomes, who would have been capable of this type of cold-blooded murder, either setting it up or pulling the trigger? Some members of the Winter Hill gang were high up on the list, including Nicholas Femia. He was an enforcer for the gang from the years 1976 and was known to be highly volatile. Whitey Bulger, the leader of the gang and a man who would later turn out to be a long-term informant of the FBI, would state that Femia was not the trigger man. We will really never know for sure, however, as Nicholas Femia was killed in 1983 during an attempted robbery when the owner of the establishment that he was apparently robbing shot him, get dunked on. By this point, Whitey Bulger was not as close to Femia as he had once been, and many have questioned if this attempted robbery just had gone wrong and it was really nothing more than just a setup to get rid of Femia and then bury him with the truth. The Fleming brothers, Stephen and Vincent Jimmy Fleming, are the other 2 names that were brought up as possibilities. Both of them had links to multiple men that died that night in the pub, and they also had previous convictions for violent behavior. Either or both of them were capable capable of the task, no doubt, but it remains up to debate whether their association with the victims made them more or less likely to have them killed. The other major crime organization at the time was the BlackFriar crime family, and it had its own share of suspects. In fact, the only two men to ever stand trial over the murders were named Robert J. Italiano and William N. Lorardi. These two men knew several of the victims and had prior convictions, but when they were put on trial in 1978, they would both end up being acquitted. So before we move into the aftermath of the massacre and then look into the legacy it left behind, there are a few other incidents that kind of spring to mind for any who have found this topic interesting. One that is probably the most similar, both in terms of notoriety and execution, would be the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This took place on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February in 1929, and led to the death of 7 people in total. 5 of the deceased were members of the Northside Gang who were involved in an ongoing bitter rivalry with Al Capone and his men. The other 2 who lost their lives were associated with the same gang. All 7 of them were lined up against the wall in a garage before being gunned down. There were 4 killers suspected to be involved, although none of them were ever formally identified. At least 2 of them were said to have been disguised as police officers, which is presumed to be the reason that the 7 victims allowed themselves to be put in such a vulnerable position and then killed. It is presumed that the 2 fake police officers came into the garage, lined up the victims against the wall under the guise of either searching them or arresting them, and when their backs were turned, their 2 associates entered with firearms and all 4 of them laid waste to the unsuspecting men. The fake officers then led their 2 accomplices back out of the garage at shotgun point as though they were being arrested to make sure that any witnesses or passerbys believed everything was above board. Although one of the victims survived for 3 hours with 14 bullet wounds, which is absolutely wild, he refused to talk to authorities before succumbing to his injuries. Okay. Anyways, so Boston itself had been no stranger to violence, death, and unsolved killings. They must have threatened that dude's family or something. And we need to look at some other alleged exploits of members of the Winter Hill Gang to see that they were really never far away from death and destruction. A bookie named Louis Latif found himself on the wrong side of the gang towards the end of the 1970s and ended up paying for it with his life. A Lebanese American, he established himself as a bookie and then a hustler, taking in large amounts of cash. Enough that the criminal elements in South Boston were interested in getting him on board so that he could start to earn for them. As his reputation and his wealth grew, it's probably Louis, became even louder and more brazen. He then took to carrying a Magnum pistol around with him and was known to pull it at the slightest provocation. He became a suspect in a killing in the mid-70s. When he managed to swerve the charge, though, without issue, he became bolder still and is alleged to have began to siphon money off of his takings in order to fund cocaine, which he both sold and began to use in excess. He would then allegedly kill a man who he had been playing cards with after an argument, before also taking the life of the only witness. This was the final straw for Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang. This was found shot to death in the trunk of his car on the 12th of April, 1980, and despite many suspicions and investigations by both law enforcement and news reporters, the crime remained officially unsolved. But, we could list a ton of unsolved murders and acts of gang violence endlessly because it is Boston. But there are times when you just gotta move ahead. These are just 2 topics that we might cover in depth at a later date to give you something else to look forward to in a little bit if this has interested you. But now, let's get back to the Blackfriars Massacre and then look into the fallout and legacy of this brutal killing. The Blackfriars Massacre would officially remain unsolved, with no one ever being convicted of what was, at the time, one of the most gruesome mass murders in Boston's history. In the years that have passed since, almost all the suspects and people associated with the victims in any way have actually passed away. Multiple of them, including Whitey Bulger, Stephen Flemmi, and William Lorardi, would all turn informant for the FBI at various points, and still, there was no conclusive evidence ever given that would finger the trigger man or even the men that night. On the balance of facts, it would seem that the most likely scenario would go as follows. Bear in mind that this is pure speculation and there are multiple other theories that could help explain the situation, but Vince Slamonti has incurred a substantial debt, possibly to the BlackFriar crime family, when it came to dealing and supplying of cocaine. He may have either held out on them when it came to payment, been late with the cash, or mislaid some portion of it. Whether this was his first time or something that happened regularly would be impossible to know. Rumors then get back about Slamonti's habit of staying late to play cards at the pub. Also, that he was sitting on a decent haul of drugs, potentially enough to wipe out the debt that he owes. Someone either gives the green light or members of the organization decide to go rogue and then bust into the pub with their guns. They would then probably not be expecting 5 men to be there, but they would also be aware that they could leave no witnesses. Once the safe was open, the men open fire, take the drugs, and leave with the carnage laid out for the janitor to find. If this hit and theft was how it went down, if it was sanctioned and who was actually involved, all seem impossible to know for sure. And if multiple high-ranking informants have really never spilled the beans after squealing on so many other things, there's a chance that they truly may not know who actually did pull the trigger that day. And at this stage, we will probably never find out for sure. I know, you're it's like, oh my God. But, so there you have it, the ruthless killing that became known as the Blackfriars Massacre. One that cemented itself firmly in the minds of the local population and far beyond. It is unlikely at this stage that we will ever be able to say with absolute certainty what happened that night, and just as the case was so often with our mystery and cryptid videos, whatever your opinion that you choose to form is, it has every chance that if there's evidence to back it up, that it could be what actually happened. So let us know if there's any other similar stories that you would like to see covered on the channel, and then we'll kind of move into that. But before ending this, I always like to do this part. Essentially, the problem with it being in the 70s is obviously there's no cameras around, and unless somebody was up to see what was actually happening, it's very unlikely that anybody could be found at any point. Now, while anybody related to the witnesses could be dead, or is dead at this point, well, not witnesses, but the people surrounding the case, one of the interesting things is I was actually watching something about this where they took DNA that it was like a murder, I believe, in the 70s or 80s, and they actually caught the person within the last couple of years because they were able to get DNA and it did match. So I wonder if possibly you could take DNA from people related and maybe find DNA that is actually, maybe that was kept, maybe some clothes, just something that would stand out in this situation that, you could be like, oh, okay, well, let's take a sample of that, sample this, and then see if maybe there was like a relation there. But what this kind of says to me, I have a different theory, right? So the whole thing with like the 70s and 80s and how they were running the White Horse. Essentially, they were flying it up from South America. They would drop a bunch of packages in the Everglades. It would get picked up and then disseminated where it needed to go, right? So I kind of feel like if you screwed around with drug lords down in South America for long enough, they would just show up, and I really wouldn't doubt if they just showed up and just took you out. That's kind of the era that this was happening in, and nobody would really know where to look because after the deed was done, they go back to their airport, they take off, you never see them again. It's impossible to know exactly what would happen because if these high-ranking people in this gang were actually informants later, yeah, they would probably be like, okay, I'm gonna try to get rid of my rap sheet on this. Let me tell you what really happened. This is sort of like Tim Allen. I hear he ratted on everybody to stay out of prison. Or Tekashi 6ix9ine. I think Tekashi 6ix9ine. He ratted on everybody to get out of prison. So that's the thing, is they will push you for all the information you have, and what would be the point of hiding it? I don't think this gang was even really involved. To be honest with you, I think this was an outside influence that nobody even really considered to be a possibility. And even if it was a possibility, how would you find them after the fact? So it's very likely whoever was associated with this, because of that lifestyle and because of the dangers associated with it, it's very likely that they're gone too, or even the organization that decided to go ahead with it, they're gone. So it doesn't really matter at this point, but what I can say is just never get involved in this crap, if at all possible. Go work a job, do it the legitimate way, because it kind of seems like when you start getting this crap involved, like doing these types of things, it's really, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of a matter of time. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leave a like, would be great of you, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to know when I post. I want to thank my patrons real quick. At the literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson West, which is Wendigray in my live streams. I know it's you, Grayson. Anyways, Michigan Dogman, Monkey Man, and Scrungle, thank you guys for your awesome support. Next, I'd like to thank our Eyewitness the Event tiers, which is Beaver Malaga and Dragon Master Knight. Then we have the secondhand accounts tier, Bianca and Fred Rush, as well as Stutz and Troy. And then, yeah, that's good right there. We don't have any firsthand accounts tier. That's okay. Just want to make sure I didn't pass by that. Anyways, so thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate it, and thank you for supporting the rest of my patrons. You guys are also awesome. That's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.